The public choice school was founded mainly by two economists, Gordon Tullock and especially James Buchanan. Buchanan takes the following approach. He says, "So, you equilibrium economists believe you perceive failures in the market. Well, for the sake of argument, we will assume that is true, and you believe that prima facie, that is, from the start and automatically, these market failures justify the intervention of the state. This is where I call your position into question. We will take a look at how the democratic state functions. We will examine, in analytical terms, the political framework in which authorities, that is, democratically elected politicians, voters who vote for them, and bureaucrats or civil servants in charge of implementing the corresponding laws act in an interrelated manner." So, public choice theorists carried out an analytical study of the ways in which such groups and processes operate, and the theorists concluded that regardless of what happens in the private sector, the democratic public sector is beset with failures that are far more serious than those which may occasionally arise in the private sector. As we have already seen, from the dynamic perspective of the Austrian school, there is a tendency to constantly avoid, detect and correct errors, with no systematic failures in the private sector. We are going to consider basically 5 reasons why democracy, democratic public management, is much less efficient than the private management that takes place via the market process driven by entrepreneurship. The first reason democratic public management is highly inefficient lies in what public choice theorists have called the principle of rational ignorance. This means that voters immediately detect or realize, either explicitly or implicitly, that their votes are actually irrelevant. And indeed, those of us who have voted are in a sense all idiots, because if in the last elections you had not voted, or you had voted the opposite way, the result would have been exactly the same. To put it another way, when a vote is taken, like when a general election is held in Spain, in which perhaps 20 or 25 million people vote, the probability of your vote being the deciding vote, which determines that certain people win instead of others, is 1 divided by 20 million. And just to give you an idea of how remote that is, the odds of winning the Christmas lottery jackpot are 200 times greater. So, one person's vote is practically insignificant. You could say to me, "But Professor, if everyone did that, then nobody would vote, and the candidates from my party would not win." Well, if that is what you think, try it. Go out and campaign. Shout. Roam the streets with a bullhorn. Whatever you want. But on election day, sleep in. Tell people you have voted, and the result will be the same. What effect does our awareness of the insignificance of our vote have? It has a public good effect, for voting with a full knowledge of the facts is not in the interest of the vast majority of voters. It is absurd. Voting with a full knowledge of the facts means carefully studying the political platforms, with all of their implications. Of course, this takes hours. It takes time and money. So, if I insist on being a fully informed voter, I bear the entire cost of the effort it takes. However, the benefit of my being a fully informed voter is spread out among millions of voters. I have just observed that the vote of any of us is insignificant, that the probability of our vote being the deciding vote is 1 divided by 20 million. Well, if I bear the entire cost of an activity, but the benefit is spread out among 20 million people, what is the result? The result is that being a fully informed voter who has considered all the angles and all the implications is not in the interest of anyone. So, what do we base our votes on? Well, we base them on emotional considerations and passions, like when we go to a soccer game. I want Real Madrid or Barca to win, and the other team to lose. We have tribal motivations. We think of good guys and bad guys, and we see this in every campaign. The low level of debate, the weak arguments, the demagogic justifications offered by the different candidates, the taboo arguments that cannot be voiced, the television debates in which one can speak for only 30 seconds, and everything depends on whether one is liked or not, and so on. We may even vote based on gut feelings. Those people are Francoists, or those people are leftists. But we do not vote with a full knowledge of the facts, because that involves a cost we would have to bear, and there would be no benefit to us, since our vote is insignificant. This negatively skews democratic public management in all democracies, even the most well-established ones. There may be differences of degree between countries, but all are beset with the same problem. However, it is not the only problem. There is a second effect, which tends to make democratic public management even more harmful, and that is the privileged special interest group effect, which is perverse. Special interest groups are relatively small groups of people and agents who discover they share a very specific incentive. If they manage to secure the support of an authority, and that person grants them a subsidy or assists them in some way, they gain quite a lot. However, the cost of that subsidy, assistance or privilege is spread out among millions of taxpayers. So, note that the members of an interest group do have an incentive to take action, to pressure authorities, and to sell their votes, because they know they stand to gain something extremely valuable. What is more, they are very likely to obtain it, because no one bothers to defend the silent majority. The cost of that assistance or privilege is spread out among millions of taxpayers, whom no one defends. Any time a particular group identifies a great potential benefit, they have an immediate incentive to launch into action and apply political pressure to gain that benefit, and at the expense of others, as is logical. So, what does democracy become? It becomes a kind of free-for-all. Most citizens vote based on gut feelings, and they have little interest in becoming informed, because that entails a huge cost, and their votes are insignificant. However, many small groups do act to pursue political advantages. Anyone can be in such a group. It will always be argued that the goal is to serve the common good, or noble causes, but groups can promote any interest. You can choose any group of people. For instance, farmers, or Hunosa miners, or feminists, or abused women, or the victims of drug addiction, or university students. All are privileged special interest groups. The government attracts all of them like a magnet, because it offers them advantages in exchange for their votes. So, what I am saying is that in the end, democracy is hijacked, so to speak, by privileged special interest groups, in an environment in which no one worries about defending the silent majorities, among other reasons because if a candidate tried to do so, he or she would lose the election. There is also a third very powerful effect that disrupts and makes democratic public management inefficient, and that is the bundle purchase effect, or the fact that democratic representation is non-binding. Every 4, 5, or 6 years, depending on the system, politicians promise us the moon, and they always identify interest groups or areas in order to buy votes. But then, once they win an election, they can do whatever they want, because representation is non-binding. That is, unlike in the private sector, we cannot say, "Listen, Mr. Zapatero, Mr. Rajoy, Mr. Aznar, or Mr. Gonzalez, you promised me 800,000 new jobs, and you have not followed through. I am going to take you to court and sue you." No, ladies and gentlemen. Representation is non-binding. The politician will say circumstances have changed, or he has changed his mind, and he will do whatever he wants, and you cannot demand anything of him. Furthermore, in many systems, people vote for closed lists, as is the case in Spain, for instance. We cannot elect the specific representative we want. Still, this is a secondary problem, which exacerbates the main problem we are discussing. But take note, what citizen is going to become a fully informed voter and spend hours studying the platforms, if she not only knows that her vote is irrelevant, but also knows that, even if it were significant, the politician could then do as he pleased, since representation would not bind him to anything. Political office would not bind him to anything except in a political sense. He could say, "Ah, well, I do as I wish. Circumstances have changed. If you disagree with me, your only option is to avoid voting for me in 4 years. By that time, I will have found a way to manipulate you again, to cook up another interest group, and to tempt you with another subsidy or some kind of assistance. Now we come to the fourth effect which public choice theorists have studied, and which explains the failure of democratic public management. We can sum it up by calling it the government short-sightedness effect. Dear students, politicians have a very short time horizon. They are concerned only about the next election, and all of their political action is skewed by this concern. Their incentive is to win the next election, which will roll around in, at most, 4 years. So they have a very limited time horizon. In contrast, in the private sector, entrepreneurs are constantly making decisions which will exceed even their lifetime horizon, like decisions involving long-term investments, perhaps the planting of trees, which may take 20, 30, 40 years to grow, and so on. People think, I will not see the results, but my children and grandchildren will. None of these long-term decisions exist for politicians. A statesman who makes decisions based on long-term criteria and on what he believes is best for his country is a politician doomed to lose the election. What a politician must do is maximize votes now, tomorrow. You will have experienced this, and you will experience it again and again. Whenever an election approaches, this conditions the debate, what we hear on TV, and what politicians say. I have seen it up close in one of the parties, and it is as clear as day to me. The advisers warn, be careful, we are in an election season. You cannot say that. They openly admit this. And indeed, you cannot say it, because even if you are convinced that it must be said, if you say it, you will lose the election. Government short-sightedness. Not surprisingly, politicians are interested only in elections. This does not mean they are bad people. It is just that in the democratic institutional framework in which they move, the next election acts as the incentive. There is a fifth reason democratic public management fails, and it involves the participation of civil servants or bureaucrats. You see, civil servants or bureaucrats, who are the people in charge of enforcing authorities' commands by following regulations, lack incentives to act efficiently. It is not that civil servants or bureaucrats are bad people. Believe it or not, they are just as good and just as bad as you or I. They are people, human beings like you and like me. The thing is that you and I act in a certain way in the context of a private company, where we risk our own money and are responsible for a profit and loss account. If we are placed in a bureaucratic environment, in the public sector, we act differently. In the public sector, there is no profit and loss account. No civil servant risks her own money. They all order drinks on the house. In other words, they spend other people's money. And here is an example I gave in class, at least in the last course. I am willing to bet you have never seen a single civil servant call a press conference and announce the following to all the expectant newspaper, radio and TV journalists. We wish to inform citizens by all available means that, having carried out a scientific, in-depth analysis of our department, be it against drugs or in defense of women or whatever, we have concluded that the cost of our department to citizens exceeds the benefit we provide, and therefore I have asked my minister to dissolve our department and let us all go. Never. Not in the past, not in the present, nor in the future. You will never hear a civil servant say such a thing. No matter how absurd her department is, a civil servant does not make such a request. What does a civil servant want? What motivates a person in a bureaucratic environment? Well, she wants to climb the job ladder, to have more civil servants working under her, to gain prestige, and to have a larger budget. And that is what a civil servant will always request, regardless of her department, whether it concerns public works, or education, or the mistreatment of women, or drug addiction. The pattern is always the same. My department is essential, and here are some important examples which illustrate that. I am facing a very grave problem. However, I do not have enough resources. I need a larger budget allocation. I need more civil servants working under me. more police officers, etc. Then my problem will be solved. That is the usual pattern. I repeat, it is not that civil servants are bad people. It is simply that, in a context in which they are not responsible for a profit and loss account, and they do not risk their own money, the institutional framework leads them to make that request. It does not matter what nonsense they are in charge of. This is the fundamental reason for the megalomania or unchecked expansion of the state. Once a commission or a department has been created, it is impossible to get rid of it. I had a good laugh the other day because someone told me that in Italy a ministry had been created, an actual government department, to deregulate the work of the other ministries. Is this true or not? A ministry for reducing red tape. Do you think this will result in fewer civil servants? On the contrary, it will result in twice as many civil servants and commissions, more people trying to bring order to the chaos, and therefore, ultimately and inevitably, more chaos. Consequently, in light of the fact that it is not in voters' interest to become fully informed before we vote, and the fact that we are the victims of privileged interest groups, and the fact that politicians concern themselves only with the short term and not the long term, and the fact that civil servants are not limited by a profit and loss account and consistently request more resources and regulations, it should not surprise you that the democratic system is a highly inefficient and imperfect system, which produces chaos and disorder in society. Furthermore, it creates perverse incentives for citizens to stop acting in a harmonious manner, and the moment anyone's privilege is threatened, everybody goes out into the streets to protest. Greece provides a recent example of this. Everybody went out into the streets. But why? We were promised we could all retire at the age of 60. Listen, in the Federal Republic of Germany, which is much richer, people retire at 67. No, I have a right to retire at 60. And everybody was protesting in the streets. Once a privilege is granted, remember that socialism and state interventionism are like drugs. It is practically impossible to do away with it.